The Metaverse, how the world's biggest tech bet fell apart $83 billion. That's not the GDP of a small country. That's not the combined net worth of 10 billionaires. That is how much one company spent, over 6 years, trying to convince you to put on a headset and live inside a cartoon. And almost nobody showed up. This is the story of the Metaverse, not the version they sold on stage with polished demo reels and breathless keynote speeches. The real version, the one with ghost towns, 38 users, boardrooms full of panic, and billions of dollars turning into nothing. It's also a story you've heard before, in different costumes. Because this isn't just about Mark Zuckerberg making a bad bet. It's about something much older. A pattern that keeps repeating in human history every time a new technology shows up and people lose their minds over it. Tulips, railroad stocks, dot-com companies, and now virtual land nobody wanted to visit. Let's go back to where it started. Before we dive in, if you're new here, this channel is about unpacking big financial stories and telling them the way they actually happened, not the PR version. If that sounds like your thing, subscribe. It's free, it helps, and I put a lot of work into these. And I want to hear from you today specifically. Did you believe in the Metaverse? Did you almost buy virtual land? Did you pitch it to someone else? Tell me in the comments. I promise, no judgment. Some of the smartest people in the world fell for this. Hit like if you want to see more videos like this. And now, let's actually get into it. To understand why the Metaverse happened, you first have to understand the world that created it. It is early 2021. The pandemic has now been going on for over a year. Hundreds of millions of people are working from home, socializing from home, exercising from home, watching TV from home. The physical world has, in a very real sense, shut down. At the same time, something strange is happening to money. Central banks around the world have flooded the financial system with cheap money. Interest rates are near zero. Stimulus checks are landing in bank accounts. And people, stuck at home with nowhere to spend, are looking for somewhere to put it. What happens when you combine massive amounts of idle capital, a population that's living digitally by force, and a technology sector that promises the future is just around the corner? You get a bubble. And in 2021, the Metaverse became its most spectacular form. Google searches for Metaverse hit record highs in January 2022. Venture capital poured into virtual world startups. The word Metaverse started appearing in corporate earnings calls from companies that had nothing to do with technology. A fashion brand would put on a virtual runway show. A bank would announce a digital branch. A consulting firm would charge $500,000 to write a company's __quote_for. The hype machine was running at full speed, and then, on October 28, 2021, it found its loudest voice. Mark Zuckerberg took the stage at the company's annual developer conference in late October 2021. But there was something different about this particular appearance. He wasn't there to talk about new Facebook features. He wasn't there to address the growing mountain of bad press around the company. Just weeks earlier, the Facebook files had been published, a trove of internal documents leaked by former employee Frances Haugen. These documents showed that the company knew, internally, about serious harms linked to its platforms. Instagram's effects on teenage mental health, the spread of vaccine misinformation, and even evidence of human trafficking facilitated through Facebook groups. Congress was furious. Regulators on 3 continents were circling. The public narrative around Facebook had curdled badly. So Zuckerberg did what any seasoned CEO would do in a crisis. He changed the subject, completely. Quote 5, quote, he said from the virtual stage. Quote 6, quote. The company, he announced, was no longer Facebook. It was now Meta. And its future was the Metaverse. Zuckerberg's ambition was not modest. He said he expected the Metaverse to reach 1 billion people within the decade. He talked about virtual environments so realistic they could transmit subtle facial expressions. He described a world where you could attend work meetings, concerts, doctor's appointments, and family dinners, all inside a headset. Some observers were immediately skeptical. One technology analyst called the rebrand a diversion, a way to change the conversation without addressing what the company had already built and broken. But in the moment, the spectacle worked. The business press covered it like a moon landing. Tech Twitter exploded, and the word, quote, 7 was suddenly everywhere. What nobody fully appreciated in the room that day was the second part of the announcement, buried in the financial disclosures. Meta intended to spend tens of billions of dollars building this thing. Once Meta put its full corporate weight behind the metaverse, something predictable happened. Everyone else rushed to join. The logic was seductive. If the internet was about to move into 3 dimensions, then you needed to be there early. You needed a presence. You needed land. Yes, land. In a virtual world called Decentraland, a group purchased a 106-parcel estate for roughly $2.4 million in November 2021. Their goal? To build a virtual luxury shopping district. In the Sandbox, a plot of land adjacent to the celebrity Snoop Dogg's virtual estate sold for $450,000. People were paying nearly $500,000 to be Snoop Dogg's virtual neighbor. These weren't isolated incidents. Real estate companies were setting up dedicated virtual property divisions. Major corporations weren't far behind. HSBC purchased virtual land, so did Samsung. J.P. Morgan opened a virtual lounge in Decentraland, complete with a digital portrait of its CEO and a roaming tiger. Nike acquired a virtual sneaker studio. Gucci built a virtual garden. Warner Music Group announced a virtual concert venue. The price of entry for all this? Tens of millions of dollars spread across dozens of companies, chasing a world that didn't yet exist. And the people selling the land? They were watching the numbers go up and smiling. Here's the question that always comes up when we talk about bubbles. How did so many intelligent, experienced people get this wrong? The answer isn't stupidity. It's something much more human. In behavioral economics, there's a concept called FOMO, fear of missing out. When an asset starts rising rapidly and everyone around you seems to be getting rich from it, the brain undergoes a genuine shift. The rational voice that says, "Wait, what is this actually worth?" gets quieter. A louder voice says, "What if you're the one person who doesn't get in?" Economists call the structural mechanism the greater fool theory, the idea that you don't need to believe something is intrinsically valuable. You just need to believe that someone else will pay more for it than you did. It works until it doesn't. There's also a framework called the Gartner hype cycle. First comes the innovation trigger. Then comes the peak of inflated expectations, the moment when the hype reaches maximum volume and valuations lose contact with reality. Then comes the trough of disillusionment, the crash. Then slowly comes the slope of enlightenment, where the technology finds its actual, more modest form. The metaverse, in 2021, was somewhere near the top of that peak, and the fall from that height was very, very steep. Before we get to the crash, we should step back, because the metaverse did not invent this story, it inherited it. In 1637, the Dutch Republic had the Tulip Mania. Rare tulip varieties were prized as status symbols. People were trading houses, livestock, and land for flowers. Then, the market simply stopped. Prices collapsed within days. In 1999, we had the dot-com boom. The internet was genuinely transformative, but the assumption was that any company with .com in its name was worth billions. Pets.com raised $82 million and was bankrupt within 9 months. When the crash came, the Nasdaq lost nearly 80% of its value. And yet, the internet did change everything. Amazon survived. Google became one of the most valuable companies in history. The vision was right. The timeline and the valuations were catastrophically wrong. This distinction matters enormously when we look at the metaverse. By late 2022, the gap between the metaverse's promise and its reality was becoming impossible to ignore. In October of that year, reports showed that the number of active transacting users on Decentraland on a single day was 38. 38, in a platform valued at over $1 billion. Even by the most generous interpretation, the numbers were nowhere near the scale that could justify the valuations. The sandbox was doing slightly better, with around 500 active users. Meanwhile, back at Meta headquarters, the internal numbers were even more embarrassing. Horizon Worlds was struggling to reach 200,000 monthly active users. At a time when Facebook had nearly 3 billion users, Horizon Worlds was being used by a fraction of the company's existing audience. Internally, employees were reportedly uncomfortable with the product. One Meta executive described the product as ___, quote _1, 0 ___ in internal communications. And yet, the money kept flowing. Let's talk about the actual financial scale. Meta's Reality Labs division has posted operating losses every single year since 2020. In 2020, $6.6 billion lost. In 2021, $10.2 billion. In 2022, $13.7 billion. In 2023, $16.1 billion. In 2024, $17.7 billion. In 2025, $19.2 billion. Total, across 6 years, $83.6 billion in operating losses from a single division, chasing a single vision. To put that in context, $83 billion is more than the combined market caps of dozens of Fortune 500 companies. It is the largest sustained corporate bet on an unproven technology in business history. And what did it produce? Quest headsets that sold in modest numbers and a platform that couldn't reach its targets. While Meta was burning through billions, another technology was quietly becoming the most consequential thing in tech: artificial intelligence. OpenAI released ChatGPT in November 2022. Within 2 months, it had 100 million users. In contrast to the Metaverse, AI assistants seemed to immediately make sense to almost everyone. Zuckerberg read the room. By 2023, the Metaverse was mentioned less. AI was mentioned constantly. And in early 2026, the shift became official. Meta announced layoffs in the Metaverse division and confirmed it was redirecting investment toward AI-powered hardware. The dream was over. The bet had failed. In the case of the Metaverse, the people who paid were the ones who got in late. Individual retail investors who bought virtual land at the peak. By 2024, land prices in the Metaverse had fallen by 95 to 99% from their highs. Small businesses that built virtual storefronts, spending real money on platforms that lost their audiences almost overnight. And then there are the employees. In 2022 and 2023, Meta laid off more than 21,000 people. Meanwhile, who won? The platforms that sold the virtual land at peak prices. The early venture capitalists who exited during the hype. The consulting firms that charged for Metaverse strategies regardless of whether they worked. This is the consistent structure of speculative bubbles across history. The people closest to the creation of the asset capture most of the gains. The people who arrive later absorb most of the losses. Was the Metaverse a scam? The technology was real. Virtual reality has genuine applications in medicine, architecture, and education. The vision of a shared, persistent, 3D internet is also not inherently absurd. But the timeline was a lie. It was a deeply unrealistic projection of how fast consumers adopt transformative technologies. The demand was manufactured. The billions of dollars pumped into it were driven by fear of being left behind. But users never showed up in the numbers that justified any of it. The valuations were detached from reality. The technology doesn't have to be fake. The vision doesn't have to be wrong. The timeline and the valuation just have to be insane. And in a world of cheap money and social pressure, making the valuation insane is surprisingly easy to do. I've spent this time walking you through the rise and fall of the Metaverse, and I hope you've noticed something. The story isn't really about virtual reality. It's about a pattern. A technology arrives. Capital floods in, prices go vertical. Anyone who questions it is labeled a skeptic. FOMO kicks in, and then, eventually, the gap between the hype and the reality becomes too wide to ignore. The question I want to leave you with isn't about the past, it's about right now, in 2026. What are we collectively doing today that future audiences will look back at with a mixture of amazement and embarrassment? Nobody knows. That's the nature of bubbles. They're hardest to see from the inside. But the signals are always the same. Assets rising faster than any rational growth can explain. A narrative so compelling that skeptics are dismissed, and a feeling that if you don't get in now, you'll regret it forever. The metaverse wasn't the first time humanity built a fantasy, priced it like a certainty, and then paid the bill. It won't be the last. If you found this video useful, share it with someone who is deep in the metaverse hype, or someone who you think needs to understand how these cycles work. There's a longer version of this story I want to tell about how the dot-com era specifically compares to what's happening in AI right now. I'll link it when it's up. See you in the next one.